came up in one of our flower beds. They're so pretty. They're peonies. And they just, at the rain, they just bend. And you're just like, oh my word, are they going to survive? And then they pop right back up. It's amazing. God's creation is amazing. What's that? Right, yes, I feel the same way. So, but anyway, they're amazing. They just pop right back. So, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We're going to finish not just this month's lessons, but we are finishing out our entire spring curriculum. I have not been here for any of the lessons on Elijah and Elisha because I've been at jail or out of town, and this is a great. I love reading through First and Second Kings and reading these stories about the prophets and the kings. So, I think they're so neat, and not just for. When I'm reading them, I'm not just reading things that are history or Bible stories, but I find them so relatable. And so I'm thankful for that. And really, the Old Testament is relatable. It's just giving us some insight into the character of God and the way that he works, and we're going to look at that a little bit today. So this is the end of those lessons on Elijah and Elisha. And we're going to talk about today healing for the outsider. Healing for the outsider. And so if you've never heard this story, we're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 5. We're almost going to read the whole chapter at some point today. So if you want to turn there in your Bible, feel free. And this is a story about how God honors obedience. And not just the obedience of people that he chooses or people who have his name or people who are his chosen people, the children of Abraham, but God honors obedience. And throughout the Bible, we'll talk about a little bit about this too, but throughout the Bible we see that God honors obedient faith. That's our obedience in action. Or our faith in action, our faith being obedient. And so he honors that. And so that's the truth about God in this lesson. But the truth for my life is that I will obey even when God's commands are unusual or unexpected. I will make the choice to obey. Has anybody ever been in a position where you felt God speaking to you or telling you to do something and you thought, that's very strange? Or a lot of times I feel like we don't even, because we know that the Bible has some weird kind of strange stories. A lot of times it's not even so much that we're like, well, that's really strange. A lot of times it's like this, there's absolutely no way I'm doing that. Has anybody ever told the Lord that there's absolutely no way that is going to happen? And then we're like, unless you make it so that Pastor Brown touches his head twice and then rubs his nose, then I'll know that you told me to do it. Y'all are laughing, but we've all been there. We've all been there. If you start doing that today while you're preaching, we're going to be. But we kind of fleece God as Gideon did. And we've all been there. I won't make you raise your hands. But the story today kind of picks up with some military leaders. And so to draw us in, and I think, if I'm not mistaken from your previous lessons, you've already kind of been talking about this. There's been some discussion about Alexander the Great and just some principles of military leadership, not just in the Bible, but throughout time. Our lesson today points out the fact that military leaders, not just biblical military leaders, but even today, prefer predictability. That's kind of true. Like, we all kind of like predictability. We like to know what's going to happen. But for a military leader, with predictability, it's easier to be strategic, to set up a solid battle plan that's going to enable them to defeat the enemy decisively and efficiently. And there's times when things are unexpected or things change in warfare that there even becomes a resistance with military leaders to do things differently. I think when I was thinking about this, one of the things that came to mind was the war that took place, and I guess you could say the battle. But when, and no matter what you think about this historically, it's always been something that was strange to me. But it seems during the time of the American Revolution and previous to that, like, warfare was really strange, right? It seems like they just set an appointment and then they all stood in lines against each other and just started shooting. Right? You know, the drummers, they had little drummers and trumpets. And so that seems odd. to me. But then, in coming to America, it seems as though there was a new warfare that was taught, right? They were taught through the Native Americans, the Indians, that they would hide, right? They would hide in ambush, which seems a little bit smarter, right? And so what had to happen is people became adaptable to that. We know they're going to, we can't just send a message and they're going to meet us and line up, because obviously they think that's crazy. So things changed about warfare during that time, and even up to the time that we live in now, things are so different. Things like urban warfare, where there's battles happening where there's civilians all around. That changes things, right? Even just present day, when there are militant groups that have no leader, no authority that they're looking to, or each little band has a leader. It just changes things. So tactics that have worked throughout history, they don't work anymore. But there are some things that have not changed, and that's what this lesson points out in the very beginning as we move into the military leader that we're going to talk about today. And that the thing that doesn't change is that soldiers have to trust each other, and they have to trust their leaders. I've never been in a warfare situation, but I can only imagine that a level of trust with the people that you're fighting for or fighting with has to be there for you to be confident in the battle that you're facing. That would make sense to me. And in my leaders, I want to know that the person who's telling me what to do knows what they're doing, has done a little research about where we're going and what we're walking into, and has looked over all of the information and knows what's happening. And I want to know that my leaders bear the burden of my life, because they do, and that they feel that. So there is that level of trust that cannot be, it has to be there. There's a short story at the beginning of our lesson today. It's about Alexander the Great and how he knew the value of trusting his men. There's a story, a legend about him, that one day he received a letter, and he was at that time convalescing. He had been injured, and he was healing. And because he would go to battle with his men, this happened a lot of the time. So he had a personal physician that would come and check on him and would medicate him as needed. And so he received a letter, Alexander the Great did, and in the letter, it spoke about his personal physician. And it was a letter from the Persians telling him that they had swayed his personal physician to their side, that he was a spy. And so very quickly after this letter was read by Alexander the Great, this doctor, the same doctor that the letter was about, appeared on the scene to give Alexander his medicine. He was a nurse. He was nursing him to health. And so the doctor hands him his medicine, and Alexander hands the doctor the letter that accuses the doctor of being a spy. And as the doctor is reading the letter, at the same time, Alexander is drinking the medicine that he had just received. Why? Because he trusted the doctor, so he boldly swallowed the medicine that could have ended his life. That's just a small example of the trust that he had in somebody, that he wasn't going to be swayed by any other information, because he knew the person, he trusted the person, he had gone through battles with that person. And in that, he showed that in that action. So many of us, though I don't know if there's anybody in this room that has faced battle like what we've been talking about, but we also know that in our life we all face battles. And sometimes it does feel like warfare. Sometimes you go through periods where you feel like you're in a boxing ring, and just as soon as you get to your feet, the enemy knocks you down again, and you just can't even catch your breath. Anybody ever been through a period of life like that, or is it just me? Thank you. I appreciate you joining me. But it's like as soon as you catch your breath from the terrible thing that just happened, you get knocked down again. And so there is a lot of fight throughout life. In fact, in the epistles, in the New Testament, in talking to Christians, there's at least 30 verses, so just the little end part of the Bible, and that's just minimal, that talks about our spiritual walk being like warfare, or being like a battle, or the armor that we have to have on. And thankfully, we serve a God that knows all, that sees all. And no matter what new tactics our enemy is going to try, we know we can trust the Lord, right? Now, how many of you has the enemy tried to sway you that the Lord is not on your side? How many of you have heard that in your mind or in your situations? The Lord doesn't care about you. He's not on your side. Or maybe even you're on the wrong side. A lot of times the enemy will try to convince us that we're in the wrong. And so if we're on the wrong side, then we can't be on the same side as the Lord, trying to get us down. But we have to trust that the Lord is, He is on our side. We are on His side. And in doing that, we have to honor the Lord with our obedience. Many times, it means that we have to honor Him and obey Him in unconventional ways, in things that are unexpected. And so our story today is about a man named Naaman, an outsider in the children of Israel, in this portion of the Bible where the story is about them. And so Naaman had some unconventional things he had to go through to receive what he needed. And he understood after his situation that it's better to trust in the Lord to receive healing than to defy God. If you want to go to 2 Kings chapter 5, we're just going to read the story of Naaman real quick, and then we will break it down. It says in verse 1, "Now Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great and honorable man in the eyes of his master, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but a leper. And the Syrians had gone out on raids and had brought back captive a young girl from the land of Israel. And she waited. She was a servant to Naaman's wife. Then she said to her mistress, 'If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, for he would heal him of his leprosy.' And Naaman went in and told his master, who was the king, saying, 'Thus and thus saith the girl who is from the land of Israel.' And the king of Syria said, 'Go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel.' So he departed and took with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothing. And then he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which said, 'Now be advised, when this letter comes to you, that I have sent Naaman my servant to you, that you may heal him of his leprosy.' And it happened that when the king of Israel read the letter, that he tore his clothes, and he said, 'Am I God to kill and make alive, that this man sends a man to me to heal him of his leprosy? Therefore, please consider and see how he seeks a quarrel with me.' And so it was, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, that he sent to the king, saying, 'Why have you torn your clothes? Please let him come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel.' Then Naaman went with his horses and chariot, and he stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, 'Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored to you, and you shall be clean.' But Naaman became furious and went away and said, 'Indeed, I said to myself, he will surely come out to meet me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and heal the leprosy. Are not the Abna and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could not I wash in them and be clean?' So he turned and he went away in a rage. And his servants came near and spoke to him and said, 'My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says to you, wash and be clean?' So he went down and dipped 7 times in the Jordan, according to the saying of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a child, and he was clean." It's just such a great story. There's so much to pull out of it. There's so much to learn from the life of Naaman and these characters, and it's such a short little passage, and then all of a sudden it's over, and yet there's so much to learn. So let's look at this. Let's start, first of all, with the faith of this little maid that is unnamed in the Bible that serves Naaman's wife. So Naaman, a Syrian, not just any Syrian, but the Syrian who is responsible for conquering lands for the king of Syria. He was favored. He was loved. But he was not of Israel. He was an outsider to the faith of Israel. And so he had probably done some pretty despicable things to the people of Israel. In fact, we see in his house this little maid who, when you look at history, because we have historical books that help us alongside the Bible, when you look at history, the fighting, the warfare that was done by the Syrians to conquer the lands like Israel would have been brutal. It's possible that this little girl was taken from her home, from her family. Her family may have been killed. She was never going to see them again. And she was put into, I don't know how Naaman came upon her, whether he was the one that physically took her from her family or he stood at an auction and purchased her after she had journeyed this long journey to get to the place where he was. I don't know how it all went down, but I know that whatever she went through to get to the place that she was at now, which was the place of a slave, it was horrible, and it was because of the work that Naaman did. And so here's Naaman. He has leprosy now, and he's beloved of the king. Now, leprosy is a death sentence. It's a slow death sentence in the time that they lived in, because not only are you now guaranteed to eventually die, a slow, painful death, you are also now isolated from everyone you love. Nobody wants to touch you. That's kind of hard to think. Nobody wants to touch you. Now, even those of you who hate physical touch, to never be hugged, to never be touched, to never be patted, whatever, ever again. That's what's except from somebody else that's diseased, which is probably the reason that they joined together so often, because they were the only ones that would be in contact with another. And to have your body deteriorate, that's what happened to Naaman. And so for his wife, for his children, for the king who loved him, he was given this death sentence, and this little girl knows that. And so, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, when you read the story of Naaman and you see his interaction with his servants at the end, and we've already read it, at the end of the story, he's angry, right? I could have gone to a clean place and washed, but you're sending me here? And his servants approach him to speak, which lets me know they felt that Naaman was approachable. They were not afraid to approach him. Even that, I mean, if you hated someone so much that you wouldn't say anything to them, then why not just let him die? They didn't have the attitude that said, well, I'm glad he won't do it, because now he won't be healed. There was some interaction with him, that there was some care there, because they didn't have to take that step. So for Naaman's house, it seems that the slaves, and that's what they were, had some interaction with their owners, with the people that they worked for. And so this young maid, however old she was, speaks up and says, in worry for her master, because you can hear it in the words, I just wish that he could go to Israel, because he would find the prophet there and the prophet would heal him. Her hope is there. And so she says that. One little line she opens her mouth to say, and it changes the course of everything. This little unnamed lady that we don't know. And so Naaman's wife, of course, then you see the progression of it, somehow gets word to Naaman. Naaman finds out, and he goes to the king. There's a prophet that is apparently able to heal me. And we see the domino effect of this outsider be able to come in and receive this healing. So first off, looking at this little girl and the example that she gives us, the lesson would ask us this question: how can we know that God is calling on us to speak up and give our testimony? Because that's what she did. Now, to me, this is the reason that you know that this young lady had some interaction and some life that she lived before she ever got to Naaman's house. Because she understood there was a God in Israel. She understood that there was a prophet that worked and operated in the power of God in Israel. So she's sharing her testimony of whatever had happened. It's amazing, because really, when you think and you look at her life was not good. And yet she opens her mouth and shares her testimony with him. You know, how do we know that it's a good idea to share our testimony? How do we know when the moment is right? And you've heard me say this before. I believe that if you are walking with the Lord, he desires to speak to you at all times, in all places. But if you're not familiar with his voice, you won't be able to hear him. So how do you get familiar with his voice? You get familiar with his word. God's voice has not changed for thousands of years. Now, for me, when I know the Lord is speaking to me, I'm 41 now. So took me a minute. I had to think of what year it was. I'm 41 now, so I've become a little bit familiar with the way that God interacts with me, the way that God speaks to me. I know what his voice sounds like, and because he knows me, he knows how to communicate with me. But I am not an anomaly. God knows you just like he knows me. And if you allow him, he will find the right way to communicate with you. So this girl, obviously, she shares her testimony in this moment. And how can we be challenged to do the same thing when opportunity arises? And sometimes, I know most of us think outside the church walls, and that is good because that's effective, and people need to hear what we have to tell them. They need to hear what's happened in our lives. But even inside the church, sometimes we're challenged when we hear somebody going through something. Sometimes there's a challenge that says, you can share what you've been through because it will help them, even those that walk with God. So, moving on in the story, looking at Naaman, who was... let's think about this too. Here he is, the person who is responsible for conquering Israel for Syria. And that's what the scripture tells us. He's like the head. And so, can you imagine him thinking, how in the world are they ever even going to let me in there? Look at all I've done to hurt them. I don't know if that went through his mind at all. But I can only imagine in human nature that there must have been something that said, well, surely this God won't help me. Look what I've done to his people. So he does go. He does go to the king. He does seek out this prophet. And the reaction of the king, it's like he just throws his hands up in the air and he's like, what am I supposed to do? He's trying to pick a fight with me. The king says this. He's asked me to do something impossible so that he has a reason to attack me again. That's what the king says. And so the king is just like, I don't even know. What am I supposed to do? But there's a reason for that. There's a little video that they have for us today that kind of walks us through some of the history of the battles that the Syrians and the Israelites had. So if you want to go ahead and play that video, Sister Clarissa, it's just a 3-minute video.
The Syrians and the Israelites have a very interesting relationship. In fact, they're related. When we read in Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 5, of a ritual where someone is supposed to bring an offering of the bounty of the land in Israel, they say a creed which says, my father was a wandering Aramean. So they are related, and yet when we read in the Bible, we find a lot of contentions between the two, particularly between the northern kingdom of Israel and the Syrians. Now the Syrians are also known as the Arameans. The land is known as Aram, and you may have heard of the language Aramaic, which has persisted throughout time, and in fact became the lingua franca of the day back in the ancient Near East. Today, the Aramaic language is almost completely lost to us. However, it became more popular in the ancient world and even survived the empires that would defeat the Syrians and the Israelites. And when we look back in time, we see the Syrians and the Israelites fighting over the same territory. And we find a particularly interesting scene when Elisha is told to anoint Hazael king over Syria. And when he goes to anoint him, he starts weeping, and Hazael asks him why. And the prophet tells him, because I know all the evil that you will do, of the young men that you will kill, the young women that you will kill, and how you will rip open the pregnant woman with children. And Hazael doesn't think that he will actually do this, and he asks Elisha why. And Elisha tells him, it's because God has showed me that you're going to be king over Syria. Hazael leaves, commits regicide by killing the king. He becomes the leader and then goes on to commit these great atrocities against the nation of Israel and sets in motion an even greater animosity between the two peoples. Later on, we read of Naaman, who has a young girl who is a captive from the nation of Israel. And when Naaman gets leprosy, this young girl tells Naaman's wife that if only Naaman could go and talk to the prophet, then he could be healed. So Naaman is sent to the king of Israel, and the king of Israel thinks that this is a pretext for war. And given the history between the two peoples, this is not surprising. And yet we see in that story God using the prophet and using this young girl to create a peace between the two peoples. And Naaman is healed of his leprosy, just going to show us that we need to love our enemies. But this animosity between the Syrians and the Israelites would persist until a bigger and badder foe appeared on the scene, the Assyrians. Remember, the Arameans are the Syrians, so these are the Assyrians. And so the Syrians and the Israelites joined together in what is known as the Syro-Ephraimite alliance, Ephraim being the name of Israel, another name for Israel based on Joseph's son Ephraim. And in the Syro-Ephraimite alliance, they want to force the northern kingdom of Judah to join them in battle, and Ahaz, the king of Israel, refuses. This is during the days of Isaiah. And so the Syro-Ephraimite alliance tries to defeat Judah and set a puppet king in the southern kingdom. They do not succeed. The Assyrians come to the rescue of the southern kingdom of Judah, even though Isaiah has told Ahaz to rely on God. And so the Syrians and the Israelites, who have so often fought against each other, and it looked like they would destroy each other, end up forming an alliance, losing to the Assyrians, and they fade from the pages of history, the northern kingdom of Israel being destroyed, and the Syrians not being what they used to be. Although that language, Aramaic, survives and is still spoken by a few people today, and Aramaic would become one of the languages that the Bible was written in.
I know, Dr. Paris is a brain. And I thought about, not even showing that. And even though maybe you only picked up a few things from it, I think what it shares was how complicated the relationship between these two nations was. That's the point here. There's a lot of complication. And I mean, the things that you heard in the beginning about the brutality that they did when they would go to battle. There's a lot of complicated things here. There's a lot of deep-seated hatred between these two nations, the nation of Israel and Naaman's nation. And so think about it this way, that the Lord showed extreme favor by even opening up the possibility for Naaman to be healed. What does that mean for us today? That in the Old Testament, ruled by the law of God, we see God offering favor that wasn't earned to somebody to be healed. How much more for us that live in this New Testament church, a time when Christ has died and risen again and given us access to his Spirit and access to his grace like never before. If he showed favor all the way back then to a complete enemy of his people, will he show favor to us who are so undeserving? All these little nuggets in the Bible, they're on purpose. And so for us who now have truth, who have been shown favor like this young maid, we may have solid reasons to withhold what we know about God from people who treat us really badly. But those are human reasons. And let me just say, that's not always in our conversations. Sometimes we are sharing what we know about God through the way that we treat people who don't deserve to be treated a certain way. And to do that, we've got to rise from our humanity, and we have to see spiritually, and we can do that. We have his Spirit. We have his Spirit. We have to, when we see hurt people who abuse our relationships, who abuse us in mind or in body or whatever that is, how can we help them who are hurting people, because hurt people hurt people? How can we help them receive healing for their wounds? I think one of the foremost things to remember is this. We have to see them as the image of God, as God's child. And we have to act like they're the children of God, that they were created by him. Maybe think back of a time in your life when you didn't know the Lord and you were acting in a way that you wish you could take back. Have you ever lived a moment and years later you wish you could take it back? Right? We've all had those moments. So we have to act like people who need God, who are hurting, and who are acting like they're sinners because they are. We have to see them through spiritual eyes. The other night, we were at Jonathan's reward ceremony for his choir, and there was this little girl, and she kept getting lost on the way back to her table. She was about this tall. She would run up and get a cookie, and every time she got to our table, she'd like almost sit down, and then she'd be like, and I just wanted to help her. She usually found her family before I could help her, but that's the way that we need to see people who are lost. Sometimes they've unintentionally gotten to the place where they're at, right? It's all they've known. Some people act the way they do because it's the only way they know to act. And if it wasn't for the grace of God, wouldn't we be in that place? Wouldn't that be who we were? And so I think just remembering that and thinking about that will help us share what we have with others. So Naaman hears about this prophet. He wants to meet the prophet. The king of Syria sends him with a letter and with all these gifts, and he goes. He doesn't even know if it's true or not. But it's like the last resort. And so he goes, and of course he gets to the king. He gives him the letter. The king is upset because he's like, well, they're trying to pick a fight with me. And it's not a short trip. I mean, he's taken, I think we may have a map picture. Do I have that map picture? I mean, this is the journey that he takes. And so you're not talking about just, driving across the Quad Cities. He goes on a journey to find this king. He goes on a 135-mile journey to Syria not by car or by train or by plane, by foot and by horse and by camel, I suppose. He spares no expense. He takes gifts. What does it tell you, the fact that he takes gifts? That he's expecting to reward someone for his healing. So there's a little bit of faith in there. Maybe he doesn't know, but there's some faith there. And he goes and he faces the king, and of course, it doesn't go as planned. And we see that as the king has rent his clothes because he's sure his people are about to be in another battle, that the prophet Elisha sends word and says, send him to me. Come on, send him over. And so, when he gets to where Elisha's at, Elisha sends out his servant. I have to be honest with you, if I was Naaman, I would have been mad too. Like, don't you know who I am? He's probably brought like a train of people with him. There's this processional up to the front door of Elisha's house. And Elisha's butler comes out and says, oh yeah, he told me to tell you, go wash in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be healed. And so Naaman is angry. The Bible tells us he's so angry. He's like, he could have at least come out and talked to me. And maybe it was a little bit based on past experience, because Naaman, for who knows, I don't know how long, Naaman had leprosy and people didn't want to talk to him. People didn't want to be around him. So all of a sudden, this person who's supposed to offer him healing also doesn't want to be around him. And so it's just hurt upon hurt upon hurt. And so he just gets mad and says, forget it. I'm not even going to do it. But he's already come so far with all these gifts, and his servants approach him and say, really? And he names 2 other rivers because he doesn't want to go to the Jordan River. I could have gone to the clean rivers. Can you show me that picture of the Jordan River? I'm going to be honest with you. I picked the dirtiest picture of the Jordan I could find. But he goes to this river where I'm sure that, like, animals eat and do other things. And he says, go dip in this river. And so he says, absolutely not. But his servants, who again, I think it shows that there's a love here for their master, say, he didn't ask you to do something hard. Do you ever, there's been times when you're sharing the gospel with somebody and it just seems so hard. Or even just sharing wisdom with somebody from the Bible. And you just want to say, he didn't ask you to do anything hard. Most of us have done hard things our whole life. And then all of a sudden God asks us something. And it's really not that hard. Oh, that we all had people like Naaman's sermons to say, it's really not that hard. You can do this. Maybe that's like we're supposed to see ourselves there too. Come on, you could do this. It's not that hard. And so Naaman says, okay. When I was a kid, there was an audio story of this that we listened to, and I remember Naaman sloshing into the water. It was just audio. I remember the water sloshing. He's complaining the whole way down about how dirty the water is. And you hear him, 1, 2, nothing's happening. 3, Master, I think there's a sore there that wasn't there before. It's gone, In my mind, that's how I hear it. So I don't know if it was progressive, that when he got to dip number 4, he got his nose grew back, or I don't know. By the time he comes out the 7th dip, he's clean, he's whole, he has no more leprosy. And of course, he's thrilled. His whole life's changed. I mean, leprosy is a very good picture of where we are at spiritually without the Lord. So Naaman gives us this picture of what it looks like, the difference between being with God and without God. And he's just thrilled. And he goes back to the prophet with all these gifts, and he wants to give him these gifts, and the prophet says, no, I didn't do it for your gifts. And so he sends him on his way. He goes off. But the prophet has a servant, Gehazi. And the servant Gehazi heard the gifts offered. And in his mind, he's like, what in the world? Why wouldn't he accept that? We wouldn't have to worry about food. We wouldn't have to worry about anything. He wants to give us changes of clothes. He should have accepted that. And he goes after Naaman without the knowledge of the prophet, without the prophet knowing, without telling him. And he says, you know what, on second thought, maybe we will take some of those gifts. And in disobedience to the man of God, he takes some of the gifts and he hides them, he buries them. This is just such a great part of the Bible because I feel Gehazi is a funny character. He's later on too. You should look him up. But he comes back to the prophet's house after hiding his wares that he's received. And the prophet said, where you been? And he says, I haven't been anywhere. I mean, read it in the Bible. I can hear him be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I've been right here. That's how I read it anyway. And because of his disobedience, because Elisha knew the truth, from that point on, Gehazi and the generations after him and his family took on them the leprosy that Naaman left behind. And that's what disobedience cost Gehazi. So we see the result of obedience. Obedience to something that made no sense. But then we see the result of disobedience to something that made no sense. Because it didn't make any sense. And we don't know why. There's no reason given. Why didn't Elisha take the money? Wouldn't it have been helpful? But something that makes no sense. And then there's disobedience to that. So in one chapter of the Bible, because it's all there in chapter 5, you see the result of the obedience and you see the result of the disobedience. And it is amazing that the obedience is healing from death, and the disobedience leads to death. You see how the Old Testament and the New Testament are just like, oh yeah, they just go together so well. I think as Christians, we have the opportunity to read that story and see the truth of God's word in it, the truth of who God is and the principles of who God is. I want to end today sharing with you, actually, chapter 6 of this same book, 2 Kings. Because the lesson, the last question it asked was, what miracle have you heard about where God moved in a mysterious way? And I mean, my mind went immediately to 2 Kings chapter 6, which is the next chapter, because in it is the strangest Bible story, in my opinion, ever. Maybe not ever, but it's right up there. I'll tell you why it doesn't make any sense. Because as someone who can read, who has access to the whole Bible, I know that Elisha asked for a double portion. Elijah did these 7 miracles. Elisha would have 14 miracles, right? So if you study through, you see that. And when I read chapter 6, and I wrote this in my Bible, and the Lord's okay with it, okay? I wrote, this seems like such a waste. I wrote, if knowing that the miracles of Elisha are wasted, this story seems like such a waste. And here's the story. Chapter 6 says, the company of the prophets said to Elisha, look, the place where we meet with you is too small for us. Well, that's a nice problem. And this is people that Elisha was teaching, okay? He was teaching these young men, these prophets, and so they are trying to get a bigger place for him to teach them. And they said, let us go to the Jordan. We're back to the Jordan, where each one of us can get a pole and let us build a place there for us to meet. And he said, go on, build a place. So then one of them said, won't you please come with your servants? And Elisha said, I will. And he went with them. And then they went to the Jordan and began to cut down trees. And as one of them was cutting down a tree, the iron axe head of the axe, it fell into the water. And he said, oh no, my Lord, I borrowed that axe. And the man of God asked, where did it fall? And when he showed him the place, Elisha cut a stick and threw it there and made the iron float. Lift it out, he said, and then the man reached out his hand and took it. One of his miracles was to make an axe head float. And then this is what I wrote. You've made me hear me talk about this before. But this is what I wrote in my Bible next to it. When you really look, there's several things that we learn in this story. And even the story of Naaman, they go together. God cares about the things that worry us, even though they seem mundane to others. God can bend the laws of nature because he was the author of them. And God is God, and I am not. And so if he wants to use a miracle to lift iron out of the water, he can go ahead and do it. And if he wants to heal somebody that I don't think is deserving or save somebody that I don't think that great of, God is God, and I am not. Let's thank him for that. Lord, thank you for your goodness, for your mercy, from everything we've learned from these stories and from your word, and for everything there is to learn in your word, God. Lord, you never fail. Lord Jesus, you are faithful. You are consistent. Your word is true, and the grace that you want to offer to us today, oh God. Lord, I thank you for it, and I pray we would lean into it today, that we would lean into you, that we would seek after you for your grace, your goodness, and your mercy. Touch each one of us and help us today, Lord, just to enter into your presence with no weights, nothing that would beset us, God. We love you and we thank you for the opportunity. In Jesus' name, amen. We'll just begin our prayer in the auditorium in just a moment here.